A landmark meeting between President Donald Trump and Ahmed al-Sharaa at the White House. The historic sit-down signals a major shift in US-Syria relations. So, how will it shape Trump's legacy in the Middle East? And what impact could it have on the region? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. Just a year ago, the US was offering a $10 million reward for the arrest of the commander of a Syrian armed group previously linked to al-Qaeda. Yet on Monday, President Donald Trump hosted him at the White House. As Syria's leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa has positioned his country as a regional player, formally joining the global coalition against ISIL. Trump has also suggested that he wants Sharaa to join the Abraham Accords and to recognize Israel. However, the Israeli military is carrying out airstrikes on Syria, more than 1,000 of them since Bashar al-Assad was ousted in December. So, could this unprecedented meeting pave the way for reduced regional tension? And how might the new US-Syria relationship reshape power dynamics and stability in the Middle East? We'll put those questions to our guests, but first a report from Alexandra Byers.
Unlike other foreign leaders visiting the White House, there was no formal welcome for Syria's president. Instead, Ahmed al-Sharaa was brought in through a side entrance for his meeting with President Donald Trump. The first official visit by a Syrian leader in nearly 80 years lasted nearly 2 hours and capped a remarkable year for the former commander of an armed group linked to al-Qaeda. Once known as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, there was a $10 million reward for his capture. 20 years later, his talks with Trump mark a major recalibration of U.S. relations with Syria.
We talked about the investment opportunities in the future in Syria, and so that Syria is no longer looked at as a security threat. It is now looked at as a geopolitical ally, and it's a place where the United States can have great investments, especially extracting gas.
Sharaa's rebel alliance toppled longtime ruler Bashar al-Assad in December, ending nearly 14 years of civil war. Trump met him for the first time in Riyadh in May, alongside the Saudi crown prince, and suspended U.S. sanctions on Syria for 6 months. On Monday, Trump waived them for another 180 days, making way for desperately needed funds for Syria's reconstruction. Only Congress can fully repeal the sanctions.
We want to see Syria become a country that's very successful, and I think this leader can do it. I really do. I think this leader can do it. And people said he's had a rough past. We've all had rough pasts.
The Syrian embassy in Washington is reopening, and Damascus has formally joined the U.S.-led coalition to combat ISIL. Trump says he hopes Syria will join the Abraham Accords and recognize Israel, which right now seems unlikely. But as President Sharaa left the White House, crowds of supporters cheered for a man who just days before was on America's global terrorist list. He's proof, perhaps, that anything is possible. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from London is Haid, a senior non-resident fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative, a think tank. From Greenville in Maine, Robert Ford, a former US ambassador to Syria. And also in London is Geist, Pinfold, a lecturer in international security at King's College London. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. I'm going to start with Ambassador Ford. Robert, as a former US ambassador to Syria, what did you make of that meeting? The fact that it happened at all, in at the side entrance, very little fanfare, and then that quote we saw in Alexandra's report afterwards, nothing about Syrian security and Israel's continuing attacks on the country. It was about business, the opportunities for US businesses in Syria, extracting gas, he talked about. Is that what Syria needs right now? How best can the US help Syria right now?
I think for the Syrians and Syrian President Sharaa, economic rebuilding, economic recovery after the long civil war is the priority. It's less so for Washington. Washington's priorities are still counterterrorism in Syria, fighting against ISIS, and also regional stability. And in particular, the Trump administration is hoping to achieve, over the longer term, a peace agreement between Israel and Syria. The Trump administration, I think, would like to see first an interim security arrangement between Israel and Syria, which would de-escalate tensions and, in particular, restrain Israel from its regular air attacks against Syrian government targets.
Haid, what would al-Sharaa have made of that meeting? Would he have seen it as a success? More importantly, what would people in Syria have made of it? How will they have interpreted what happened?
I think for al-Sharaa, the fact that he was able to be invited to the White House, meet Trump for nearly 2 hours, have meetings with different U.S. officials is a big achievement. Maybe it falls short of basically convincing or seeing the full removal of the Caesar Act on Syria. However, he still managed to basically achieve a significant improvement in the ties between the two countries, and most importantly, by joining the international coalition against ISIS. Now Syria has the potential of building strong ties with U.S. institutions. Also, there has been progress on removing restrictions on the Syrian diplomatic mission in the U.S., which basically would allow Syria to become diplomatically active there. Now, when it comes to how Syrians view it, I think it would depend on which group you are referring to. In general, the majority would welcome this visit because it would potentially lead to the removal of sanctions, allow potentially for Syrians to even travel to the US more easily, but also allow investments to basically start flowing into Syria. But you have then one group, especially those who don't recognize the legitimacy of the transitional government in Syria, might not see that positively, might see that basically this is an added sort of step that would embolden al-Sharaa and prevent him from providing some sort of political concessions to the groups that remain outside of Damascus's control. And then finally, you have the hardliners, whether those are basically locals or foreigners who remain inside Syria. And most of those would view this negatively because they still view the US as the main sort of enemy for them and for their ideology. So seeing al-Sharaa, who was for some their leader until recently, and still their leader for some, and then for others a key ally, moving in that direction and joining the fight against ISIS, would see that as a betrayal. So and it depends on really on which group you're looking at.
Okay. Rob, picking up on what Ambassador Ford was saying about the US wanting to see perhaps an interim security deal between Syria and Israel. Of course, Israel continues to conduct strikes on Syria. What are the chances of that happening? What would it take to allow that to happen?
Well, you're right. Israel is continuing to conduct strikes against Syria, and the number of strikes it's launched against Syria since the Assad regime fell is indeed unprecedented, but that just makes an agreement all the more necessary from the eyes of both the Syrian government and the US government. Now, remember that when Trump came to power, he was more or less parroting the same lines that we heard coming out of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, that Syria is basically a mess, that Jelani is a terrorist, that we shouldn't be involved with them, whereas there has been a remarkable pivot in US strategy and policy towards Syria, away from that and away towards the Gulf position, that Ahmed al-Sharaa is a decent guy. He's made a real transformation, that he is a pragmatist, that he's someone worth engaging with, and he's the best hope for a stable Syria. Now, the key issue here is that the Israelis have not bought this. They have been pushed in a more positive direction, I would argue, than they had previously by the Americans, but there's still this lingering perception in Israel that al-Sharaa is an unreformed terrorist, that Syria is a hotbed of lawlessness, that he doesn't have any control over his own forces and troops. So even if he has transformed, it doesn't really matter, and that he really has minority groups like Druze, but also others like Alawites and Kurds in his sights as well. So overall, I think we are seeing some positive steps, but tentatively positive steps. The US has moved away from basically shoving Syria into joining the Abraham Accords, something that was unlikely and would always destabilize the Syrian government, and instead looking towards a disengagement or a deconfliction agreement between Israel and Syria, which will be very, very important for helping to stabilize Syria. If, for example, the Syrian government commits to protect minority groups, Israel commits to respect Syria's territorial integrity, those will be very, very important and meaningful steps towards Syria being able to really get itself on its feet and stabilize, rather than that whole process being interrupted on a more or less monthly basis by Israeli raids and airstrikes.
I want to come to the Abraham Accords in just a few minutes. But first, Rob, just to pick up on something that you were saying at the beginning of your answer there, Ambassador Ford, what explains President Trump's attitude to Sharaa? This is a man, as we were saying, who had a $10 million bounty on his head a year ago. What is it about him personally that appeals to Trump? One wonders whether Sharaa would be being brought in from the cold like this under any other US president. How do the people around President Trump feel about it? Does it make some of them queasy, perhaps?
It is quite remarkable. And I do not think that had Joe Biden won the election a year ago, that Washington would have gone as far as Trump has gone, rebuilding a relationship with the new Syrian government. Two quick things. Number one, Donald Trump personalizes foreign policy. Many of his foreign policy decisions, if not most, result from Donald Trump's personal assessment of his relationship with the foreign leaders involved. And Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Turkish President Erdogan, and the Emir of Qatar all have very good relations with Donald Trump, and all of them have pleaded President Shara's case to Donald Trump personally. And I think that has a lot of influence on Donald Trump. I have heard from people in Washington that some in the Trump administration, the new Trump administration, were actually very reluctant to engage so quickly with President Sharaa. And that is one of the reasons that several of them lost their jobs in the National Security Council. So Donald Trump wants to move ahead. And I would add a second point here. I think Donald Trump looks at Ahmed Sharaa himself personally, both as a young, strong leader, those are exactly Trump's words, and someone who is willing to make decisions, and Trump really likes that because he too likes to make decisions. Now, we will see if Donald Trump's assessment of President Sharaa plays out correctly over the longer term.
Hayed, coming to the Abraham Accords, I mean, feel free to pick up on what Ambassador Ford was saying there, but as far as the Abraham Accords are concerned, do you foresee a time perhaps when Syria will be brought into the Abraham Accords? How much pressure will al-Sharaa come under to fall into line on that? Would it be politically tenable within Syria for him to do so?
I think it will be quite difficult at this stage to discuss the ability of Syria to move forward with joining the Abraham Accord for different reasons. One, because of the big issue of the Golan Heights, without addressing that issue. That whole region is still occupied by Israel, and Israel is refusing to basically recognize the legitimate sort of request from the Syrian side to give it back. So this will be a major sticking point if Sharaa accepts to move on without and normalize with Israel without addressing that big question. He will lose legitimacy, and then potentially he might trigger some local resistance against him from even his own group. Now, there is also another issue related to practically, is it possible at this point to do that? There are many issues that would be required to be addressed and agreed upon before you reach that sort of level of normalization. Israel occupies currently territories inside Syria, and they have occupied those new territories after the fall of the regime. Israel, as mentioned in your report, still carries out attacks and operations inside Syria. So without addressing those issues and ensuring that those military operations would stop, how can you talk about diplomatic relationships between the two countries? And the last sticking point, I think, will be the issue of the truce in Sueda, because Israel has continued to use that card in order to justify its intervention in Syria under the protection of minorities. Will they continue to do so in the future? And if so, then that would definitely undermine the ability of al-Sharaa to reunite the rest of the country under the umbrella of Damascus. So unless those issues are addressed, we cannot see potentially any progress on any format of normalization between the two countries.
Rob, have Syria's relationships with its former allies, Iran and Russia, now been eclipsed by this burgeoning relationship with the US under Trump? What's the perception of all of this in Moscow and in capitals like Beijing, Ankara? I mean, is the balance of influence in Syria now in the post-Assad era shifted?
Well, one of the points or talking points that pro-engagement US officials have repeated again and again is that if we don't go in there, if we don't exert our influence and pivot Syria in a more positive direction, then it will revert to form. You know, we will see, for example, Russia reassert itself in Syria. We will see Iran take advantage of the instability in the country to reassert and reestablish its smuggling networks in Syria, for example. And it's important to note that, you know, we saw Trump rescind some of those sanctions, or at least delay their reimposition through presidential executive orders. Those sanctions have still not been repealed by Congress, for example. And another important point here is that there was an exemption to these sanctions that were rescinded. There's still sanctions being upheld by the US against Syrian firms that do business with Russia and Iran. Now, disengaging or disentangling Russia from Syria is no easy task. Remember that Russia has been very much embedded within Syria for decades. It's been a key ally, but even with the fall of the Assad regime, the Syrian armed forces are still reliant on Russian equipment. They need Russian parts to repair those weapons and equipment, for example. Syrian cash is still being printed by a Russian company. So I think one of the key reasons to engage, to pivot Syria away from that orbit, is to basically retrench Russian influence. And then the Iranian angle is different. Iran will reassert itself through instability in Syria, through the government being a government in name only that can't exert its authority within Syria. So that's the second plank here of the US's engagement policies with Syria, a recognition that a strong Syrian central government is not a problem, it's actually a solution. If we have a weak Syrian central government, if we have an excessively divided Syria, then this is exactly the sort of power vacuums that groups like ISIL will utilize, but also state-level threats like Iran will too. So this is more or less why the US is engaging with Syria. Yes, they see an opportunity, but they also know that if they don't, someone else will exploit that opportunity.
Robert, you were talking about President Trump and his views on al-Sharaa. He sees him as a young leader, dynamic, a man who can get things done. What's your assessment, though, as a former US ambassador to Syria, of how al-Sharaa is doing in terms of uniting Syria under one flag, one government?
So the good news is that Syria, since the fall of the Assad government 11 months ago, has not become a new Libya. And I think many of us, certainly I was, concerned that it might slip into that kind of a scenario with different armed factions fighting each other across the country. That said, there's just enormous challenges in front of the Syrian government and in front of President Sharaa. The American visit did not deliver the kind of permanent revocation of the hardest American sanctions, secondary sanctions against foreign companies. It only suspended them for 6 months. I don't think that's going to be a big encouragement to Western and perhaps even Gulf investment in the Syrian economy, which desperately needs that investment, pardon me. And it's interesting that Ahmed Sharaa, of all people, was on the very conservative U.S. television network Fox yesterday, speaking about investment. That's quite remarkable. So the second thing, and we just cannot say it enough, is that, and Hyde was talking about this a little bit ago, that there are groups, minority communities scattered across Syria that are still very nervous about the future. And I don't think Ahmed Sharaa has done enough yet to address their concerns, speaking very frankly. And the absence of some kind of public accountability is really beginning, I think, to make things harder for the Syrian government as it moves forward. It's certainly harder with respect to the relations between Damascus and the northeastern part of Syria, the autonomous administration area, led by a particular Kurdish militia. And it has also made things much more difficult with the Druze community centered around the southern province of Sueda. And although there are reports, Reuters had a report in September, that a number of government security officials had been detained because of charges that they had violated human rights of Syrian citizens in Sueda. We have seen nothing public, and it's hard, therefore, to know whether such reports are accurate. And so that is an unmet challenge, an unfulfilled challenge still in front of the Syrian government.
Well, let's bring in Hyde on that. 1 in 4 Syrians lives at the moment in extreme poverty, meaning that they survive on $3 a day. When are they going to see a difference to their lives? When is all of this positive movement on the diplomatic front going to filter through to ordinary Syrians?
I think that's the question that every Syrian is currently asking, because on the one hand, you see that the country has been able to really restore diplomatic ties with regional and international governments. The suspension of sanctions was mentioned and basically started in May. Then you see also big announcements of investment deals and contracts signed. However, the average Syrian has not been able to really see much improvement in their day-to-day life. Actually, I'd argue that their living conditions have become slightly worse only because the basic services and the prices of essential goods like fuel, bread, and even electricity the prices have increased. So because of that, you see that people are, I think, more and more feeling that, okay, when are we basically feeling resentful that they're not seeing any progress? Or to give credit to the transitional authorities, they have been able to increase salaries for civil servants by 200% recently. But the gap between what people earn and the cost of living is still massive.
Rob, we're rapidly running out of time here. This is a question that I could put to either you or Ambassador Ford. It's your turn, so we'll go with you. How might Monday's meeting reshape the narrative around Trump's whole legacy in the Middle East compared to his predecessors? What message is he sending to US allies in the region? Not only Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. I mean, how does this meeting reflect on Trump's broader alliance strategy?
What I think it will do is basically reinforce that broader change that we've seen in Trump, from shifting from basically reiterating Israeli talking points vis-a-vis Syria, but also other countries, to being far closely more aligned with the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, states like Qatar, and also the UAE. Remember that when the Assad regime fell, it was the Saudis and the Qataris that were the first to turn to Washington and say, look, we can make something better here, give Syria a chance. We need to, for example, to remove those sanctions. At first, the US were reluctant to do so. The Israelis were really pushing hard for them not to do so. And Syria is one of those issues recently in the Middle East where we saw a clash between the Gulf lobbies and the Israel lobbies in Washington, D.C. over shaping and influencing US policy. So I think this is part of a broader trend of the US pivoting away from just listening to the Israelis to also listening to some of the partners in the Gulf region. Those countries have often been described as Trump whisperers, and I think Syria demonstrates why that is indeed the case.
Okay, very, very briefly, Robert, do you want to add to that?
I think the Trump administration is trying very hard to isolate Iran in the region, especially Iran. And so to the extent that they can establish a firm, solid relationship with Syria, it will not only diminish Iranian influence in Syria, but it will also facilitate diminution of Iranian influence in Lebanon. And so I think the realists in the Trump administration, and there are many, they're aiming in that direction.
Okay. Gentlemen, there we must leave it. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Inside Story today. Haid, Robert Ford and Rob Geist. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can always join the conversation on X, our handle there, at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again.